Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm not sure when you're going to be watching this, but this is Mrs. Firth from Lakeside High School, and I'm here to talk to you about American realism and naturalism. Okay, this is a chapter or a period in American literature from 1861 to 1914. So it follows directly after the American Romanticism and Transcendentalism unit that you've just finished. The term realism describes the period of American literature from the beginning of the Civil War in 1861 to the beginning of World War I in 1914. It's a fairly small window of a literary period. And as with other literary periods in American lit, it begins and ends with the war because wars so often change the way that Americans see themselves and see the country. And so often that changes the way that we make art and it changes the way that we write literature. And so that's exactly what happened with realism. The Civil War made life so horrible, and so many people died in America that they felt they could no longer fantasize or imagine like the Romantics did. Suddenly, all of that soul searching, living in a cabin by the lake, and seeing the great oversoul and the nature of the woods and the nice stories that Hawthorne told and the scary stories that Poe told, those just seemed ridiculous to people who had seen true horror and war and who didn't really care about, some sort of oversoul looking after them in nature. So that's why the Civil War began a new literary period. Romanticism was out, realism was in. And the period also includes or is considered a companion to naturalism, but more on what that is later. This period includes authors such as Mark Twain, who's probably the only one you might have heard of already. He wrote Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. It includes Henry James, Bret Harte, Stephen Crane, and Jack London, etc. And they all wrote fiction devoted to the accurate representation and exploration of American lives. These guys were not interested in flowery junk and talking about their feelings like Poe and Emerson and Thoreau had been. They were not interested in writing pretty stories about rich people, and they wanted to write the truth. They wanted to show things as they were in their experience in America. Hence the name realism. They wanted to write about what was real. And as an offshoot of that, they wanted people to know where they were from. All of a sudden, there were a lot of authors writing in America who were name checking their hometowns, writing in the dialect of their particular region. So, for example, Mark Twain was from Hannibal, Missouri, and so that's where the Huckleberry Finn novel begins. And most of the characters in Huckleberry Finn speak in dialect. He spells the words the way that they sound when people from the South say them. You'll see this later as well in a modernist novel called Their Eyes Were Watching God, which we'll look at in a few weeks. Anyway, that tactic is often referred to as local color or regionalism in American literature. It also made people feel more connected to the literature because they'd pick it up and say, oh, this story is set in White Bluff, Montana. I've been to White Bluff, Montana, so I'm going to know more about this story. That wasn't always true, and of course it could have the alternate effect that if you hadn't been to White Bluff, Montana, you would feel somewhat estranged from the story. But for the most part, it helped people come to understand more about all the different regions in America. Okay, here are the major elements of American realism. These are the things that you're going to want to write down on a piece of paper in your notebook because you might see these kinds of things again on something like, I don't know, like a quiz or something that might happen in the future at some date. Okay, I hope I've stalled long enough for you to get a piece of paper out and you're about to take some notes here. Great. Okay. So, in American realism, detail is always more important than plot. As a matter of fact, I can't offhand think of a realist story or novel that has a plot that makes any sense at all. Huckleberry Finn, for example, is notorious for its terrible, terrible plot. A young white boy and a middle aged black man flee slavery by heading south in the Mississippi River. That's terrible. I mean, that's the worst idea ever for a plot. You'd want to go north, right? Well, except for that Mark Twain didn't know that much about the north end of the Mississippi, and so he wanted to write about the area he knew, so he had the characters make some really bad decisions just so he could stay in a region that he understood. And as far as he was concerned, the plot didn't really matter. What mattered were the details that he was going to give about the region they passed through on the Mississippi. And what mattered to him was also their character. The character of those two stories was far more important than the plot. The subject of a realist piece of literature is often a complex ethical choice. Now, obviously, the type of choice is going to change from place to place. From story to story, depending on who wrote it and where it's set. But the main idea behind any realist piece is that a character has had a big choice to make, and they have to struggle to figure out what the right choice is. Also, class is important. Middle class is always going to be more prevalent than the upper class in realist literature, and also the working classes as well. The realists were far more interested in writing about people they knew and people who were like them. And in the case of American writers, those were the poor and the middle class people. So you're just not going to see many upper class characters who are presented fairly and completely in realist literature. Events are also going to be believable in realist literature. Obviously, it can't be real if you don't believe it. So if something happens in a realist story that you can't believe could ever possibly happen, then it's not a realist story. Also, the diction, that means word choice, is common vernacular. No snooty language in realist literature. If you read any Nathaniel Hawthorne in your romantic literature unit, you know what I'm talking about. In realist literature, there will be no more of those these and thous and such. Realists tried to write the way people spoke. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have big vocabulary words in realism. It just means that they're going to speak plainly in a grammar style that you recognize. Also, lots of realists chose to include dialect. So you'll get words like ain't and shoot in realist literature, and you would never see that in romantic literature. The tone of realist literature can be comic, satiric, or matter of fact. Huckleberry Finn, of course, is both comic and satiric, but the pieces you're going to be looking at this week are definitely matter of fact, plain, serious stories, which is also part of the time period. Okay, I'm moving on. Okay, you can upgrade realism to naturalism. Naturalism is like adding a pay channel to your basic cable package of realism. Okay, it's everything that you already learned about realism plus the idea that people and their lives are often deeply affected by natural forces such as heredity, environment, or even chance. That's the bold part that you probably saw here, right? People and their lives are often deeply affected by natural forces such as heredity, environment, or even chance. But the big idea is that people cannot control such forces, yet they must carry on the best way they can. In other words, naturalist stories are about how the world is trying to kill you. Did that sink in? Naturalist stories are about how easy it is to fall prey to the natural world and about how just chance things that can happen to you over which you have no control can be your downfall. As you might imagine, Most naturalist literature is not really a feel-good experience. Most naturalist pieces are kind of grim and sad. Sorry about that. But keep in mind, this was during a time period between 1861 and 1914 in which a lot of people felt grim and sad. Okay, so if you're reading a piece from 1861 to 1914 and you want to ask yourself, is it naturalist or is it realist? Well, naturalism is just realism plus the idea of the lack of control. Now, realist stories and novels can be comic or serious, but naturalist stories are always very somber and nearly everyone dies because of nature. If you're reading a story that's set somewhere between 1861 and 1914 and almost all of the characters are dead at the end of that story, then you know for sure you've got a naturalist piece of literature in your hand. Now, for example, I want to show you a clip from a very old movie that is shortened on YouTube. And it is a dramatization of the short story To Build a Fire by Jack London. Okay, let's look at some of this. Here we go. BBC in 1970, very old, I promised. Okay, so I'm going to mute this for a minute. This guy is going on a walk through the Klondike in Alaska, and he's been warned not to go because it's too cold. Oh, no, no. And he just fell, and he's put his foot into water, which is extraordinarily dangerous in such cold weather because it's something crazy like 50 degrees below. Okay, here we go. Oh, he's mad.
This would delay him an hour, for he'd have to build a fire and dry out his footgear. This was imperative at this low temperature, he knew that much.
Okay. So he's real mad at himself, and he's going to build a fire for the next 2 minutes. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. So anyway, he gathers up a bunch of wood, and he tries to build himself a fire. And here we go. He's done it, or he's about to.
The man worked slowly and carefully, keenly aware of his danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the twigs with which he fed it. He knew there must be no failure. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. That is, if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and restore his circulation. But the circulation of wet and freezing feet cannot be restored by running. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze the harder. All this the man knew. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek had told him about it the previous fall, and now he was appreciating the advice. Already, all sensation had gone out of his feet, and in building the fire, his fingers had quickly gone numb.
Okay, in case you're wondering what that is, it's a big chunk of snow on a branch over the fire, and the old man has not noticed that it is dangling precariously over the fire that he just built. So, I bet you can figure out what's going to happen.
But he was safe. Toes and nose and cheeks would only be touched by the frost, for the fire was beginning to burn with strength. In another 5 minutes, he could remove his wet footgear. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek. The old-timer had been very serious in laying down the law that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. Well, here he was. He'd had the accident. He was alone. And he had saved himself. All a man has to do is to keep his head, and he's all right. Any man who's a man could travel alone. But he had not thought his fingers could go lifeless in so short a time. The wires were pretty well down between him and his finger ends.
Okay, that's all that's on YouTube, but you get the idea. This is basic realist drama. Okay, this man goes off into the wilderness and the wilderness kills him, because that's ultimately what happens. I can't remember all the details, to be honest with you. It's been a really long time since I read the whole story, but obviously he freezes to death, and I can't remember if he kills the dog before he freezes to death and tries to warm himself inside the dog and it fails, or if the dog eats him after he dies. I can't remember, but obviously it's not going to work out well for anybody in this story. Now let's look back at those realist things I was talking about before. Okay, so obviously in To Build a Fire, detail and character are far more important than plot, because there's hardly any plot at all to this story. A man goes out into the freezing wilderness and dies. That's the story. In the middle, he tries to build a fire. It doesn't work. He dies. That's it. So obviously you can see how this is more detail and character driven than plot driven. The complex ethical choices in this story, well, the first ethical choice he makes is to go out into the wilderness by himself when he's been warned not to, and he does it anyway. And we see that that is a stupid choice that he makes, and he pays for it. This man is a middle-class man. There are no snooty upper-class people going to fancy parties and long dresses and tuxedos in this story at all. I also find the events fairly believable. I do believe that if you go out in 50 below weather by yourself with your dog, it's pretty reasonable that you might die, because that's a dumb choice that you made. The language was pretty straightforward, as you heard the narrator. You probably didn't have any trouble understanding him. And the tone, of course, to this is very matter-of-fact, very direct. But then on top of that realist core to the To Build a Fire story, you got the naturalist edge. This is about how people cannot control the forces around them. This guy thought he could control them. You saw how he was all pleased with himself, thinking, well, if you're a man, you can survive in the wilderness, and I'm a man, and I did it. But then, of course, nature comes and shows him that he absolutely cannot. He cannot beat nature. He can't even beat chance or an accident, because that's how he got into that mess in the first place, by getting his foot wet. So anyway, that's how to build a fire is a perfect example of both realist and naturalist literature. Now, for the rest of this week and probably the next, you're going to be looking at various other examples of realist and naturalist literature before we look at some nonfiction from the post-Civil War, pre-World War I period. Anyway, I'll be in and out of your class this week, and if you have any questions, come talk to me. I'm Miss Firth across the hall. Good luck, you guys.